Millions of viewers loved Grace Kelly as the tough, resilient mother who held her family together. But the second the cameras stopped, Brett Butler tore everyone apart. She was the highest paid actress on TV. Then she destroyed everything. While America found comfort in her hit sitcom, her own cast and crew were trapped in a daily reality of fear, addiction, and abuse. How does a beloved working-class hero become a ruthless tyrant? And why did Hollywood executives fund the nightmare until it finally collapsed? Born in early 1958 in Montgomery, Alabama, Brett Butler's initial reality was entirely devoid of Hollywood glamour. Biographical records and her own accounts paint a grim picture of her formative years. She grew up in a financially strained household, living under the heavy shadow of a father who struggled with severe alcoholism and physical abuse, alongside a mother battling deep depression. The cycle of trauma appeared seemingly inevitable when Butler, still in her youth, entered into a marriage with a man who also proved to be abusive. Yet, demonstrating a fierce instinct for self-preservation, she eventually found the strength to leave. For years, she navigated the harsh realities of the working class, spending long hours as a waitress and a cocktail server, simply to survive. It was within this daily struggle that she sharpened her voice. In the 1980s, Butler channeled her painful experiences into the demanding world of stand-up comedy. Her delivery was far from the polished, light-hearted routines common at the time. It was sharp, unapologetically direct, and deeply satirical. She transformed the grim realities of domestic hardship and social class into biting, intelligent humor. This raw authenticity resonated with audiences and caught the attention of industry scouts, ultimately catapulting her onto the national stage with a career-defining appearance on The Tonight Show. By 1993, television executives at ABC recognized the immense potential in her perspective. They launched Grace Under Fire, a sitcom conceptually built around Butler's own life experiences. She portrayed Grace Kelly, a resilient single mother in a small Missouri town, newly divorced from an abusive husband and recovering from her own battles with alcohol. The American public responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. The series was a massive, immediate hit, frequently securing a spot in the top 5 of the national television ratings during its very first season. Butler transitioned practically overnight from a struggling, road-weary comic to a television powerhouse, a role that would reportedly earn her around $25 million over the lifespan of the series. However, this monumental success created a perilous illusion. On the television screen, Grace Kelly was the idealized portrait of overcoming adversity, a woman who had firmly closed the door on her traumatic past and emerged victorious. But out of the public eye, Brett Butler was still carrying the heavy, unresolved baggage of childhood poverty, domestic abuse, and her own early struggles with dependency. For a brief, dazzling period, the blinding flash of fame and an influx of unprecedented wealth successfully camouflaged these deep psychological fractures. The audience and the industry saw a triumphant star at the absolute peak of her glory, entirely unaware that the unresolved darkness of her past was already beginning to seep into the foundation of her newfound empire. She was essentially living a fractured existence, paid millions to flawlessly portray the exact type of stable, healing mother she never had the chance to be. Every day on set required her to channel her deepest traumas for public consumption, then neatly pack them away when the director called cut. This relentless psychological whiplash created an invisible, crushing exhaustion. The studio had bought her backstory, but they provided absolutely no psychological support to help her carry the emotional weight of monetizing her own pain. The specific architecture of mid-1990s television power set the stage for the coming disaster. When a network sitcom breached the top 5 in national ratings, it ceased to be a mere television program. It transformed into a corporate anchor, a multi-million-dollar industry unto itself, generating immense advertising revenue and the promise of even more lucrative syndication deals. At the absolute center of this financial machinery stood Brett Butler. The executives at ABC and the producers at Carsey Werner were acutely aware that without her face, her voice, and her specific brand of working-class authenticity, the entire machine would instantly grind to a halt. Butler quickly recognized this leverage, and the dynamic on the soundstage began to undergo a radical and deeply destructive transformation. On the screen, the character of Grace Kelly was the embodiment of empathy and constructive resilience. She was a woman who listened patiently to her neighbors, supported her friends, and actively built a safe environment for her children after years of domestic turmoil. She was the ultimate caretaker. However, a sharp and undeniable contrast was emerging behind the cameras. The woman portraying this pillar of support was rapidly becoming a source of intense pressure and volatility for everyone in her professional orbit. The very concept of the strong, resilient mother was mutating into a shield, effectively masking an individual who was beginning to exercise absolute control over her environment through fear and intimidation. The first major casualty of this power shift was the show's creator, Chuck Lorre. Lorre, who had conceived the premise and crafted the initial voice of the series, found himself in a rapidly escalating power struggle with his leading lady. Butler, drawing heavily on her own traumatic past and stand-up background, fundamentally believed that she possessed the sole authentic understanding of the character. She began to actively challenge Lorre's scripts, disputing dialogue, rejecting storylines, and questioning his creative authority on the set floor. In traditional television production, the creator and showrunner holds the ultimate authority. But Grace Under Fire was no longer a traditional production. It was a dictatorship built on ratings. The conflict reached a breaking point at the end of the first season. Forced to choose between the writer who created the hit and the star who delivered the audience, the producers made a calculated business decision. Chuck Lorre was pushed out of his own creation. This was a watershed moment, sending a chilling and unmistakable message to the entire cast and crew. Brett Butler was now untouchable. The removal of Lorre effectively eliminated the only figure of authority capable of challenging the star or establishing professional boundaries. A massive power vacuum was created, and Butler immediately filled it, consolidating her control over every aspect of the production. She no longer had to compromise or listen to opposing creative visions, effectively turning the writer's room into an echo chamber for her own impulses. Directors who dared to offer basic stage directions were met with icy stares or outright hostility, rapidly learning that questioning the star was professional suicide. By eliminating the only person who could set boundaries, she dismantled the crucial checks and balances required to keep a massive television production grounded. She was steering a multi-million-dollar ship entirely alone, completely blinded by her own unassailable authority. With the primary opposition removed, the environment in the writer's room and on the soundstage darkened considerably. The collaborative process of television making was replaced by a rigid regime of appeasement. Writers, many of whom were highly experienced industry professionals, found themselves working in a constant state of anxiety. Scripts were subjected to aggressive, last-minute rewrites based entirely on Butler's shifting moods. Disagreements over character direction were no longer debated. They were shut down, often accompanied by public dressing downs. The star began to dictate not only her own lines, but the blocking, the lighting, and the performances of her co-stars. This unchecked authority began to manifest in deeply toxic ways. Crew members reported a daily atmosphere of walking on eggshells. A misplaced prop, a lighting cue that took too long, or a joke that did not land during rehearsal could trigger aggressive outbursts. The irony was glaring. The set was dressed as a warm, inviting Midwestern home, representing safety and recovery, but the physical space of the soundstage had become a hostile workplace. Actors and technicians alike were forced to navigate the unpredictable temper of a woman who held their financial security entirely in her hands. To complain was to risk immediate dismissal, as everyone knew management had already demonstrated their loyalty to the star over the staff. This brings the focus directly to the enablers, Carsey Werner and ABC. These were not naive organizations. They were fully briefed on the screaming matches, the delayed schedules, and the soaring anxiety levels among the crew. Yet their response was rooted entirely in the mathematics of the television business. As long as the program pulled in 20 million viewers a week, internal chaos was categorized merely as an operational expense. Instead of enforcing professional boundaries, they built a fortress of non-disclosure agreements around their star, dispatching fixers to quietly pay off traumatized crew members. They actively chose to manage the symptoms of her abuse, prioritizing the lucrative syndication finish line over the psychological safety of their workforce. This systemic complicity was the crucial mechanism that allowed the environment to rot. By refusing to establish boundaries, the producers validated Butler's worst impulses. They taught her that her power was truly absolute, that there were no consequences for her actions, and that the rules governing professional conduct did not apply to the person generating the highest revenue. This is the danger of structural power dynamics in the entertainment industry. When a corporate entity prioritizes its profit margins over the psychological safety of its workforce, it actively constructs the very scaffolding for a crisis. For Butler, this lack of limitation proved to be disastrous. She was a woman carrying the deep, unhealed wounds of a traumatic past, suddenly thrust into a position of supreme authority with millions of dollars at her disposal, and an entire corporate structure dedicated to shielding her from accountability. It is a psychological reality that power does not necessarily corrupt. Rather, it amplifies and exposes the existing fractures within an individual. Without the necessary professional guardrails, the pressure of maintaining a #1 show, combined with her own internal demons, created an unbearable psychological weight. She was controlling the set, but she was rapidly losing control of herself. The network had successfully protected their investment in the short term, but by ignoring the fundamental toxicity of the workplace they had fostered, they set the stage for an explosive and inevitable collapse that would soon push the star and the entire production over the edge. The unchecked power that had taken root on the soundstage was a dangerous enough element on its own, but it was soon violently accelerated by the introduction of severe chemical dependency. The physical toll of carrying a massive network television series combined with the crushing psychological weight of her unresolved past, began to manifest directly in Brett Butler's body. She developed a severe case of sciatica, an agonizing nerve condition that causes intense shooting pain down the back and legs. In the high-stakes environment of a multi-camera sitcom, where a star is required to be on their marks, hit their comedic timing, and project boundless energy for hours on end, debilitating physical pain is viewed as an unacceptable production delay. To manage this excruciating condition and keep the lucrative machine running, Butler was prescribed the powerful painkiller Vicodin. What began as a legitimate medical intervention for physical agony quickly morphed into a catastrophic addiction, but Vicodin was only the surface of the crisis. Beneath the chemical dependency, Butler was actively battling undiagnosed severe mental illness. Years later, she would publicly reveal that she was suffering from bipolar disorder and complex PTSD, direct, untreated consequences of her deeply abusive childhood. The pills became the only mechanism she had to artificially manage extreme manic highs and crushing depressive lows. Furthermore, as her onset behavior grew more tyrannical, her real-life personal support system was collapsing. Her second marriage to Ken Ziomek was rapidly disintegrating under the immense weight of her fame and erratic behavior, eventually leading to a painful divorce. The contrast was harrowing. She was earning millions, playing a woman successfully holding a fictional family together, while her actual marriage was shattering and her mind was fracturing. Her descent into this chemical and psychological abyss was a steep, visible decline. As her tolerance grew, the lines between prescription management and desperate substance abuse entirely vanished. The addiction severely hijacked the absolute authority she had already established, creating an environment that was not merely difficult, but actively dangerous. The pills did not simply numb her physical pain, they aggressively dismantled her remaining impulse control and professional filters. What started as sharp, demanding perfectionism rapidly mutated into paranoid, drug-fueled delusions that targeted anyone within her line of sight. She was no longer just a demanding star. She was a profoundly unstable addict, holding the livelihoods of hundreds hostage to her erratic chemical rhythms. The studio lights now illuminated a woman fundamentally detached from reality, delivering punchlines with a vacant, terrifying stare. Observers noted a haunting vacancy in her eyes during table reads, a stark departure from the razor-sharp comedic timing that had made her famous. The pills fractured her perception of time and professional boundaries, leading to spontaneous, illogical script changes demanded in the middle of a taping. She was no longer steering the ship. The chemicals were dictating her every impulse, turning a once disciplined performer into a deeply unreliable narrator of her own life. The production schedule became entirely subservient to the erratic rhythm of her dependency. The atmosphere on the set of Grace Under Fire devolved from tense apprehension into outright terror. Accounts from crew members and industry insiders suggest a workplace completely, entirely unhinged from professional norms. Butler's behavior became wildly erratic and terrifyingly unpredictable. A scene that had been rehearsed peacefully 1 hour could erupt into a screaming match the next. Witnesses described instances of physical outbursts, with objects being hurled across the soundstage in fits of chemically fueled rage. The crew, the writers, and the supporting cast were essentially trapped in a daily hostage situation, held captive by the volatile mood swings of a woman who was visibly deteriorating before their eyes. They were required to manufacture light-hearted working-class comedy while surrounded by the dark, suffocating reality of active, untreated addiction. The most distressing manifestations of this collapse extended far beyond verbal abuse, crossing lines that inflicted deep, lasting psychological harm on those who were most vulnerable. The most infamous and deeply tragic incident involved John Paul Steuer, the talented 12-year-old actor who portrayed Grace's eldest son, Quentin. Children working in television are inherently vulnerable, relying on the adults around them to maintain a safe and nurturing environment. That safety was shattered in a profound way. During a period of extreme personal instability and loss of behavioral control, Butler allegedly crossed severe professional boundaries and exhibited highly erratic conduct around the young actor on set. This was not a mere lapse in judgment. It was a deeply unsettling disruption of a child's workspace. The psychological impact on Steuer was immediate and severe. Recognizing the profound instability of the environment, his parents and representatives intervened swiftly, pulling the child from the hit series immediately after its third season. He was quietly recast, with the network offering little public explanation to the audience at the time. The tragedy of this event is magnified by its lasting consequences. John Paul Steuer was so profoundly disturbed by the toxic realities of the industry that he eventually stepped away from acting entirely, a promising career extinguished by the collateral damage of a star's unchecked unraveling. The adult supporting cast, while perhaps more equipped to process the chaos, fared no better in this toxic crucible. Julie White, the highly respected actress who portrayed Nadine, Grace Kelly's fiercely loyal best friend, found herself in an agonizing position. On screen, the chemistry between Grace and Nadine was the emotional anchor of the series, a beautiful depiction of women supporting women through the trials of addiction recovery and domestic survival. Off-screen, the reality was a grotesque mirror image. White was forced to endure a daily barrage of unprofessionalism, watching her colleague and scene partner self-destruct while making the working lives of everyone in the building a misery. For a working actor, voluntarily leaving a top-rated, highly lucrative network sitcom is a monumental, almost unthinkable decision. Yet by the end of the fourth season, the psychological toll of the hostility, the delays, and the unrelenting stress proved too much to bear. Julie White walked away from the series. While official press releases were carefully worded to maintain professional decorum, it was an open secret within the Hollywood community that White had essentially fled a sinking ship, choosing her own mental health and professional dignity over the massive paychecks tied to a profoundly sick environment. White's departure was the ultimate, unignorable alarm bell ringing through the industry, signaling that the environment was beyond repair. For Butler, losing her most crucial scene partner meant severing one of her last tethers to reality, accelerating her downward spiral. The chemistry that had anchored the show's success was replaced by forced, awkward interactions with new cast members struggling to navigate the tension. The loss proved that no amount of syndication revenue could buy loyalty on a set defined by daily psychological warfare. Her departure sent a shockwave through the remaining cast, serving as a bleak confirmation that the situation was truly beyond repair. Those who stayed found themselves trapped in a grueling cycle of trauma bonding, sharing knowing, terrified glances as they navigated the daily minefield of their stars' unpredictable moods. They became involuntary caretakers, tasked with propping up a collapsing pillar just long enough to capture a few usable minutes of film. The sound stage transformed into a clinical triage center, stripped entirely of its creative joy. The production itself began to buckle under the weight of Butler's addiction. The meticulously planned schedules of network television were routinely destroyed. Filming days were abruptly canceled when the star was simply too intoxicated to stand under the studio lights. The producers were forced into a chaotic cycle of halting production, entirely to send Butler to various rehabilitation facilities, only to rush her back onto the soundstage the moment she was deemed minimally functional, praying she could hold it together long enough to capture 22 minutes of usable footage. The focus of the entire enterprise shifted from creating quality television to merely surviving the week. Consequently, the quality of the show suffered a steep and noticeable decline. The sharp, authentic writing that had initially captivated the nation felt increasingly strained and hollow. The timing was off. The energy was frantic. The audience, though perhaps unaware of the harrowing specifics occurring behind closed doors, intuitively sensed the disconnect. The ratings, once securely anchored in the top 5, began a steady, undeniable descent. The viewers were tuning in to watch Grace Kelly, the resilient survivor, navigate her hard-fought sobriety with humor and grace. Instead, the camera was capturing the hollowed-out performance of a woman actively losing her battle with addiction, reading lines about recovery while fundamentally detached from reality. The ultimate tragic paradox had fully crystallized. The fictional mother was celebrated globally for conquering her demons, while the real woman was being completely devoured by them, dragging an entire production down into the abyss with her. The narrative frequently spun by corporate entities in the aftermath of a public Hollywood disaster is one of institutional ignorance. There is often a concerted effort to claim that the true severity of the situation was somehow hidden from the upper echelons of management. However, in the case of Grace Under Fire, historical documentation, industry testimonies, and the sheer logistical reality of network television paint a starkly different and deeply troubling picture. The executives at ABC and the producers at Carsey Werner were not operating in the dark. They were comprehensively and intimately informed. They reviewed the daily production reports that detailed the agonizing delays, the ruined takes, and the escalating insurance liabilities. They fielded the frantic, desperate calls from the representatives of the traumatized supporting cast. They knew exactly what was happening on their soundstage. Yet the corporate response was never to dismantle the toxic environment or establish firm professional boundaries. Instead, it was to aggressively manage the optics of the crisis while keeping the machinery moving at all costs. The ruthless mathematics of the 1990s television industry drove this systemic complicity. The ultimate financial prize was not the initial broadcast advertising revenue, but the syndication market. Selling a successful sitcom into daily reruns on local stations and international networks generated hundreds of millions of dollars in pure, unadulterated profit. However, to unlock this massive financial windfall, a studio typically needed to produce a library of nearly 100 episodes. When Brett Butler's addiction began to severely fracture the production and endanger the crew, Grace Under Fire was roughly halfway to that sacred, highly lucrative finish line. This financial reality is the grim, unavoidable lens through which every executive decision regarding the show must be viewed. The producers were not operating a rehabilitation clinic, nor were they acting as moral guardians for their workforce. They were managing a wildly valuable corporate asset that was threatening to depreciate before it reached its maximum valuation. The executives calculated the human cost, the daily anxiety of the crew, the psychological distress of the co-stars, and the rapid visible decline of Butler's own physical and mental health, and weighed it directly against the projected syndication revenues. They made a conscious boardroom decision that the profit margin entirely justified the ongoing human casualties. The studio's approach became a masterclass in institutional enabling. Rather than prioritizing the safety of the workplace or issuing a definitive ultimatum that might halt the cash flow, management constructed an elaborate, highly funded scaffolding around their failing star. When Butler's condition deteriorated to the point of requiring clinical intervention, the network did not make the difficult decision to cancel the season. Instead, they absorbed the massive financial penalties of shutting down the sound stage, entirely rewrote the production calendar, and waited for her to complete abbreviated, often rushed stints in rehabilitation facilities. They effectively transformed a professional television set into a high-stakes, deeply dysfunctional waiting room. These mandatory hiatuses were never about genuine healing. They were calculated pit stops designed merely to render her functional enough to stand before a camera. Medical professionals were frequently pressured to accelerate her discharge, prioritizing shooting schedules over her long-term neurological recovery. The studio was essentially treating a life-threatening illness with the same urgency and superficiality as a broken prop. It was a ruthless cycle of stabilization and immediate exploitation, ensuring she never had the requisite time to truly address her deep-seated demons. This strategy required the implementation of a deeply cynical operational policy regarding the rest of the staff. The dozens of working-class professionals who comprised the crew, the camera operators, the script supervisors, the lighting technicians, were treated as entirely expendable. If a crew member expressed genuine distress over the verbal abuse, the unpredictable hostility, or the chaotic schedule, they were quietly and efficiently replaced. The unwritten but absolute rule on the studio lot was clear. The corporate machinery must protect the star at all costs, and anyone who could not endure the collateral damage was free to surrender their livelihood. Simultaneously, a massive public relations apparatus was deployed to actively deceive the American public. Publicists worked overtime, strategically planting sanitized stories in the entertainment press. They framed the halted productions and erratic behavior as bouts of exhaustion, crafting a narrative of a brave woman fighting valiant personal battles. This carefully orchestrated corporate fiction maintained the wholesome image of the show to ensure the ratings did not completely collapse, while the people actually trapped inside the soundstage were left entirely to fend for themselves against a deeply unstable employer. This dynamic sharply highlights the fundamental moral failing of the studio system. The tragedy of Grace Under Fire diverges significantly from the often told stories of exploited child stars who lack agency and are victimized by the system. This was a scenario involving a powerful adult woman whose highly destructive behavior was being actively shielded, subsidized, and facilitated by a multi-billion-dollar corporate apparatus. The industry's culture, at the time, frequently utilized the trope of the difficult genius to excuse horrific workplace behavior, provided that the individual in question was generating revenue. This institutional complicity had a profoundly devastating psychological effect on Butler herself. Addiction is an illness that thrives in isolation, but it accelerates exponentially in an environment completely devoid of boundaries or consequences. By continually rescuing her from the professional fallout of her actions, the studio executives became the ultimate codependent partners in her descent. They constructed an artificial reality where she was entirely insulated from the normal rules of human conduct. Every time she lashed out, every time she derailed production, the studio simply wrote a check, smoothed over the incident, and ushered her back in front of the cameras the moment she could stand. This toxic symbiosis convinced her that she was truly untouchable. The enabling did not save her. It severely compounded the severity of her illness. She was trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded entirely by people whose own salaries and bonuses depended on never telling her the truth or holding her accountable. The studio provided the absolute power and the endless financial resources that allowed her addiction to reach catastrophic levels without ever forcing a true moment of reckoning. The profound irony of the entire enterprise was inescapable. Grace Under Fire was celebrated globally as a triumph of working-class feminism. It was lauded by critics for shining a compassionate, honest light on the struggles of blue-collar women and the harsh realities of surviving domestic turmoil. Yet the corporate structure producing this progressive, empathetic narrative was actively engaging in the ruthless exploitation of its own workforce. They were systematically dismantling the mental health and professional security of their employees to service the bottom line. It was a staggering hypocrisy that defined the era's approach to television production, preaching resilience and community on the screen while fostering a dictatorship of fear behind the curtain. When a workplace becomes a site of psychological hazard, the blame naturally falls on the individual exhibiting the destructive behavior. But a single individual, no matter how famous or highly paid, cannot sustain a reign of terror for years without the active infrastructure of a compliance system. The executives who signed off on the daily reports, the managers who silenced the complaints, and the network heads who demanded the episodes be delivered regardless of the human toll are irrevocably woven into the fabric of this disaster. They gambled with the lives and careers of hundreds of people, betting heavily that they could push a severely ill woman across the syndication finish line before she completely collapsed. It was a calculated, cold-blooded wager driven entirely by the pursuit of perpetual profit. However, even the most deeply entrenched systems of corporate protection have an absolute limit, and that limit is always dictated by the mathematics of the bottom line. By late 1997, the deeply frayed rope that had kept the production of Grace Under Fire suspended over the abyss finally began to snap. The fifth season was intended to be a triumphant continuation of the franchise, with a massive 25 episodes commissioned by the network. Instead, it became a slow, agonizing death march that definitively exposed the fatal flaws of the studio's containment strategy. The atmosphere on the soundstage had moved beyond mere toxicity. It had descended into complete operational paralysis. The highly orchestrated schedules required to shoot a multi-camera network sitcom were reduced to daily guesswork. Crew members arrived at work at dawn, completely unaware if the star would arrive, if she would be coherent enough to remember her blocking, or if the entire day would be abruptly canceled at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars to the studio. The public relations machinery, which had worked so tirelessly to spin the narrative of exhaustion and heroic recovery, found itself entirely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of production delays and the undeniable visual evidence of Brett Butler's decline. Repeated desperate attempts to send her back to rehabilitation facilities during the filming of the 5th season yielded no lasting results. She would return to the set, and within days, the catastrophic cycle of erratic behavior, hostile outbursts, and physical inability to perform would violently resume. The writers struggled to craft coherent storylines around a leading lady who could barely sustain focus for a complete scene. The supporting cast, those who had not already fled the hostile environment, delivered their performances with the hollow, exhausted expressions of individuals simply trying to survive a crisis they had no power to stop. What truly triggered the final lethal blow to the series, however, was not a sudden awakening of corporate morality or a newfound concern for the psychological well-being of the crew. It was a cold, calculated shift in the financial reality of the asset. The executives at Carsey Werner and ABC had endured the chaos, subsidized the rehabilitation stints, and ignored the rampant verbal abuse for years, driven by one singular objective: crossing the syndication threshold. Once a television program banks a sufficient number of episodes, historically around the 100-episode mark, it can be sold into highly lucrative daily reruns across the globe. By the time the fragmented, disastrous 5th season limped through its 14th episode, Grace Under Fire had officially crossed that sacred finish line. The show had accrued 112 episodes. The incredibly valuable syndication package was secured. The library was complete. The moment that financial milestone was achieved, the corporate calculus shifted instantly and brutally. Brett Butler ceased to be an indispensable asset requiring infinite protection. She immediately transformed into a massive, unnecessary liability. The tolerance for her addiction, her outbursts, and her costly production delays evaporated overnight. There was no longer a multi-million-dollar incentive to keep the chaotic machinery moving. The studio no longer needed new episodes to guarantee their massive payday. They already had the product they required to generate revenue for decades to come. In February 1998, the executioner's axe fell with terrifying speed. There was no grand farewell, no final emotional episode carefully written to wrap up the storylines, and no graceful exit for the beloved character of Grace Kelly. ABC simply pulled the plug. The series was abruptly and permanently canceled. Production was halted immediately, freezing the show exactly where it stood, leaving 11 commissioned episodes entirely unfilmed. Brett Butler was summarily fired from the empire she had built, stripped of her title, her platform, and her unprecedented authority in a single devastating corporate maneuver. The very executives who had spent years coddling her worst impulses, providing private jets and luxury accommodations, now treated her as an infectious liability. Her security badges were deactivated, and her personal effects were swiftly cleared from the lot. This rapid transition from an untouchable deity to a barred outsider was a staggering psychological blow. There was no severance negotiation or graceful exit strategy. The studio simply legally amputated the liability to protect their highly profitable syndication assets. The sudden, brutal efficiency of her removal exposed the central lie of her reign. She was never the untouchable queen she believed herself to be. She was merely a highly compensated piece of machinery, discarded the exact moment she stopped generating profit. It laid bare the transactional nature of her existence. She was loved only as long as she was lucrative, and disposed of the moment the math no longer favored her survival. The immediate fallout of this cancellation was a masterclass in the collateral damage of Hollywood power structures. while the headlines naturally focused on the spectacular downfall of the highly paid star, the true silent tragedy unfolded on the studio lot. When a network sitcom is canceled mid-season without warning, the financial devastation trickles down instantly. Hundreds of people, the camera operators, the carpenters, the lighting technicians, the makeup artists, and the production assistants, were thrown out of work with absolutely no notice. These were not multimillionaires. These were working-class professionals, many living paycheck to paycheck, relying on the stability of a hit show to feed their families and pay their mortgages. The irony was as bitter as it was unavoidable. Grace Under Fire was celebrated as a beacon for the American working class, a show that deeply empathized with the daily struggles of blue-collar survival. Yet, the destruction of the show, brought about by the unchecked behavior of its wealthy star and the calculated indifference of its corporate owners, inflicted profound financial trauma directly upon its own working-class crew. The people who had endured years of psychological abuse, hoping simply to maintain their livelihoods, were ultimately discarded the moment the executives decided the star was no longer profitable to manage. They packed up their tools in the sudden eerie silence of a dead sound stage, collateral victims of a disaster they had spent years trying to navigate. For Brett Butler, the psychological shock of the firing must have been entirely disorienting. For 5 years, she had existed in a highly insulated reality where her power was absolute, her behavior was constantly excused, and her every demand was met by an army of handlers. The studio had functioned as a massive enabling shield against the consequences of her severe addiction. When that shield was abruptly withdrawn, she was left entirely exposed. The transition from the reigning queen of American comedy to an industry pariah was instantaneous. The phone calls from powerful producers stopped immediately. The publicists who had crafted her image vanished. The executives who had smiled through her outbursts now refused to take her calls. She was entirely stripped of the fictional armor of Grace Kelly. She could no longer hide behind the image of the resilient, recovering mother that the public so deeply admired. She was left alone in the devastating quiet of the aftermath, forced to confront the wreckage of her career, the severe reality of her chemical dependency, and the undeniable fact that she had alienated nearly everyone in her professional sphere. The sudden absence of the daily production schedule, the adrenaline of the set, and the constant influx of massive paychecks created a terrifying vacuum. The industry that had eagerly capitalized on her talent and actively enabled her destruction had now efficiently disposed of her, moving on to the next bankable star, leaving Brett Butler to face the sheer, unmitigated gravity of a complete and total freefall. The aftermath of a spectacular Hollywood collapse is rarely loud. It does not echo the chaotic, screaming intensity of a production sound stage or the frenetic energy of a publicity crisis. Instead, it is characterized by a sudden, deafening, and absolute silence. For Brett Butler, the days and weeks immediately following her dismissal from Grace Under Fire in the early spring of 1998 were defined by this terrifying quiet. The immense corporate machinery that had governed her every waking moment, the publicists, the managers, the studio executives, the personal assistants, and the daily production schedules, vanished overnight. The telephone, which for 5 years had been a constant conduit of lucrative offers, urgent demands, and high-stakes negotiations, simply stopped ringing. The industry had extracted the syndication value it required, surgically excised the liability she had become, and instantly moved forward without her. This immediate isolation forced a brutal psychological reckoning. During the height of her television reign, Butler's identity was entirely intertwined with the fictional persona of Grace Kelly and the tangible power she wielded on the ABC lot. She was the star, the boss, the untouchable center of a multi-million-dollar universe. Stripped of that title, she was suddenly confronted with the raw, unshielded reality of her existence. A woman battling a profound, untreated chemical dependency, carrying the heavy burden of a tarnished professional reputation, and entirely alienated from the community that had once celebrated her. The enabling structures that had shielded her from the consequences of her addiction were gone, leaving her to face a sheer, terrifying freefall without a safety net. Seeking refuge from the unforgiving glare of the Los Angeles entertainment press, Butler made a decisive geographic retreat. She abandoned the epicenter of her former glory and relocated to a farm in Georgia. This move was intended to be a sanctuary, a place to finally achieve the sobriety that had eluded her in Hollywood, far removed from the pressures of network television. However, geographic distance rarely cures internal affliction. The farm, spanning acres of quiet rural land, offered isolation, but isolation for an individual deep in the throes of addiction can be a dangerous environment. Without the mandated schedule of a production or the financial incentive to maintain a public facade, the battle for sobriety became a lonely, grueling, and often failing endeavor. Stripped of the daily adrenaline and the sycophantic validation of the studio system, she was forced into a terrifying confrontation with her own mind. The quiet fields of Georgia offered no distraction from the immense guilt of the careers she had derailed and the bridges she had burned. Her addiction, no longer masked by the frantic pace of television production, raged with renewed ferocity in the emptiness of her new life. She was essentially serving a self-imposed exile, haunted by the echoing memories of a kingdom she had personally burned to the ground. Simultaneously, the financial reality of her situation began to metastasize into a crisis. To the general public, the mathematics of television stardom suggest permanent security. Butler had earned an estimated $25 million. Yet, the trajectory of immense wealth managed through the fog of severe addiction is historically devastating. The fortune hemorrhaged rapidly, but not solely on typical Hollywood excesses. While massive sums were absorbed by high-end rehabilitation facilities and poor investments, Butler also funneled a significant portion of her remaining wealth into a desperate attempt to find purpose. Upon moving to Georgia, she turned her farm into an animal sanctuary, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars rescuing abandoned horses and dogs. This created a poignant psychological mirror. A woman who could not save her own career or her own marriage was pouring her dwindling resources into saving discarded animals. However, without a steady income, the massive overhead of this sanctuary, combined with the lingering costs of her past entourage and unstructured spending, rapidly accelerated her bankruptcy. Within a shockingly brief period, the financial empire she had built entirely dissolved, leaving the former highest-paid actress in comedy struggling to maintain basic solvency. As the years bled into the early 2000s, the name Brett Butler transitioned from a marquee draw to an industry cautionary tale. She was effectively blacklisted from the major networks. The executives who had once tolerated her volatility now viewed her as an uninsurable risk. To survive both creatively and financially, she was forced to return to the very foundation of her career, stand-up comedy. But returning to the comedy club circuit was no longer the triumphant victory lap of a massive television star. It was a humbling, often humiliating exercise in survival. She was performing in smaller venues, facing audiences who came not just to laugh, but to gawk at the fallen icon. The ghost of Grace Kelly stood right beside her on every stage, a constant, inescapable reminder of the staggering heights from which she had fallen. Slowly and with agonizing difficulty, Butler began to piece together a functional sobriety. It was not the sanitized public relations managed recovery touted during her television years, but a quiet, grueling daily battle fought in absolute obscurity. As her health stabilized, she attempted to quietly reintegrate into the acting profession. She actively sought out the kind of work she had once casually dismissed. She took on minor supporting roles, appearing as a guest star in series like Anger, Management, The Leftovers, and The Walking Dead. The contrast on these new sets was stark and illuminating. She was no longer the sovereign ruler of the sound stage. She was a day player, a hired hand required to hit her marks, deliver her lines, and quietly return to her trailer. Colleagues from this era reported a deeply humbled woman, professional and quiet, entirely devoid of the tyrannical demands that had defined her past. She was a working actor again, grinding out a living in an industry that had fundamentally forgotten her former absolute power. Yet despite her undeniable talent and her hard-fought professionalism, these roles were sporadic. The stigma of being difficult is a permanent ink in Hollywood, notoriously hard to wash away even decades after the offenses were committed. The true depth of her post-fame reality was laid bare to the world in 2021, creating a moment of profound public shock and melancholy. Decades removed from her $25 million peak, Brett Butler found herself facing imminent homelessness. Her financial reserves were entirely depleted, exacerbated by ongoing health issues and the brutal, unforgiving economics of aging in the margins of the entertainment industry. She was 6 months behind on her rent and facing immediate eviction. In a devastating display of vulnerability, she was forced to allow a close friend to launch a GoFundMe campaign simply to keep a roof over her head. The image of the former queen of ABC television relying on the digital charity of strangers and former fans to avoid living on the street was a jarring, tragic spectacle. It served as the ultimate, undeniable proof of the complete evaporation of her empire. The campaign raised enough money to prevent her eviction, a testament to the lingering goodwill of the audience, who still remembered the comforts she had once brought into their homes. However, the necessity of the campaign itself was a brutal indictment of the trajectory her life had taken. The woman who had once commanded a small army of assistants was now reduced to pleading for basic sustenance in the public square. It dismantled the enduring myth that Hollywood royalty are perpetually insulated from the harsh economic realities faced by ordinary citizens. This very public plea for help forced the industry to confront the broken human being they had left behind. Though few executives offered any tangible support, it was the ultimate humiliating stripping of her dignity, cementing her status as a cautionary tale of exploitation and financial ruin. The final enduring contrast of Brett Butler's life after Grace Under Fire is rooted in a quiet, inescapable tragedy. If you turn on a television today and find a rerun of her sitcom, you will see Grace Kelly perfectly preserved in amber. Grace remains the ultimate survivor, the woman who confidently navigated poverty, defeated her addictions, and built a warm, secure fortress for her family. She is frozen in a state of perpetual triumph. Audiences today watch those reruns completely blind to the agonizing off-camera reality required to produce those 22 minutes of laughter. The syndication tapes act as a pristine, sanitized tombstone, burying the destruction of her mental health beneath a perfect sitcom smile. They remain a permanent, highly profitable monument to corporate denial. The industry successfully preserved the myth of Grace Kelly while completely abandoning the woman who bled to create her. But the woman who breathed life into that immortal character was forced to live out the deeply flawed, highly vulnerable reality of a mortal life. Brett Butler had to face the grueling consequences of her own unchecked power. She had to navigate the brutal, unglamorous reality of long-term recovery without the safety net of a studio check. She had to learn how to survive the total loss of her identity, her fortune, and her industry standing. Her later years are not defined by the triumphant, neatly resolved conclusions of a 30-minute sitcom. They are defined by the raw, quiet courage required to simply keep breathing, keep working, and keep surviving long after the world has stopped watching, leaving her completely alone to manage the heavy, lingering ghosts of a spectacular and devastating past. It is far too easy to look back at the collapse of Brett Butler and dismiss it as merely another predictable cliche of a spoiled celebrity succumbing to their own vices. To do so, however, is to miss the profound and unsettling truth at the heart of this tragedy. Her story is not a solitary failure, it is a damning indictment of an entire industry. The true horror of Grace Under Fire was not simply the addiction that ravaged its star, but the cold, systemic complicity of a corporate machine that actively subsidized that destruction. Hollywood executives calculated the exact monetary value of a toxic, abusive environment and decided that the psychological safety of a working-class crew and the literal survival of a deeply ill woman were entirely acceptable sacrifices on the altar of syndication. They did not just tolerate the fire, they continuously supplied the oxygen, so long as the ratings kept climbing. This leaves us with an ultimate catastrophic formula: unchecked power, combined with untreated trauma, nurtured by an enabling system that prioritizes profit over basic human decency. Great success, no matter how unprecedented or lucrative, must never serve as an excuse to abandon accountability. When a corporate structure refuses to establish boundaries and say no to a powerful star, it is not protecting them. It is actively participating in their ruin. Brett Butler was a brilliant, razor-sharp comedic mind who mined her own profound suffering to give a nation a survivor they could believe in. Yet, while millions laughed and found solace in her fictional resilience, the real woman was left to drown in plain sight, completely surrounded by people who were paid handsomely to watch her sink. Like so many meteoric, self-destructive icons we examine, her legacy is not just a canceled sitcom, but a haunting, unresolved question. When the studio lights finally power down and the canned laughter fades, exactly how high a human cost are we willing to accept for our entertainment?